Do you believe that government itself, or all governments, could actually change the course of the Earth's climate in any way? And if not, what are the proposals that could actually have an impact?
Not in the way that they're going about it, because fundamentally, and as you point out, look, we're trying to make agreements, and they did that in Cancun and all the other climate meetings, where they're basically trying to tell everyone, we know that you like your fossil fuels because it basically supports jobs and the economy, and it gives you heat in the winter and cool in the summer and all these other great things that you like. But could you stop using that? Would that be okay for you? And not surprisingly, nobody actually wants to say that, but everybody goes there. They sort of say, sure, I'll do that in 10 or 15 years or something when somebody else is in power, and then nobody does it. That's not, surprisingly, not a terribly good way to do it. Now, you have some people, and increasingly so in much of the rich world, that are actually going to try to do something along those lines. So, Biden in the U.S. and much of Europe, Justin Trudeau in Canada, and many other places, where they're actually saying, look, we're going to spend a lot of money to try to at least rip a little bit of this engine of growth out from our economy. Again, this is going to be fairly costly. It's not going to cut very much, and we've seen how hard it is to actually do this. And of course, once the price starts increasing, most people will say, screw that, I'm going to vote that guy out. Right. So this is an unsustainable and unrealistic way, mostly, to try to fix the problem, which is why it's failing, and which is why I'm trying to say there's a much, much smarter way to do this. Fundamentally, look at what the U.S. did, again, back with fracking. Fracking was basically this idea that we can get to a lot of gas in the U.S. that we couldn't before with a new technology. So, the U.S. DARPA basically, DARPA and the Department of Energy spent a lot of money on funding guys who thought we can do this, but it's not commercially viable right now. They spent probably about $10 billion in total. It turned out to be a fantastic deal for the U.S. Right? It makes you, because it made much cheaper energy available, you probably got rich to the tune of about $180 billion every year, at least for a decade or so. This has been a great idea. There are also costs. The total environmental cost is probably in the order of $20, $25 billion. So it's not nothing, but much, much smaller than the benefit. And here's the kicker. It turns out that gas emits much less CO2 than coal. And when you make gas cheaper, a lot of people stop using coal and start using gas instead. And so the U.S. has actually cut its carbon emissions much more than any other nation over the last decade and a half. So both through Obama, Trump, and Biden. Not primarily because you were green, but because this innovation made it cheaper to switch to frack gas.
Right.
This tells you the very simple point. If you can make greener technology cheaper than fossil fuels, people will switch. That's what we need to do.
Until the government steps in and says, no, that's a big problem, right, with American policy. You have an administration, the Biden administration, who paused a lot of fracking leases or any new developments. Yes. And that kind of brings us to, obviously, he's doing this in line with the UN, in line with a lot of these guidelines, because gas bad, right? And I think it's very important that you just brought up, hold on a second, you need to do a risk, a cost-benefit analysis. It's better than other forms of energy. Doesn't matter. Politically, they've said gas bad, and now fracking is not nearly, it's not growing nearly as quickly, and may come to a point if proposals make it through where it may not be allowed at all, or we have to phase it out. So that brings in, okay, if we're talking about governments and these proposals, and your proposals, by the way, are so reasonable compared to the SPG, like this thing is a wish list for children, like end poverty. Great. Yes. So I appreciate yours, but who are the adults in the room, right? If we have, for example, Donald Trump saying, oh, and this Paris agreement isn't going to do what we need it to do, and Biden saying, no, we're going to sign on, and also I'm going to end fracking. Because I know for someone from Denmark, it would be very hard to give any credit to someone like a Trump as it relates to fracking and saying, maybe the policy of ending fracking isn't quite reasonable, but that's what we're doing.
Yes. Yeah. Look, so fundamentally, I think it's going to be hard to really stop the fracking revolution because it's actually powered so much of the U.S., both economy, and also if you stop fracking, you're actually going to go back and emit a lot more CO2.
Right.
What we do need is to get China and India to frack so that they can also cut their carbon emissions, and become rich at the same time. So there's a huge opportunity there. But my point here is to say we need to make sure that policymakers support a lot more of that kind of innovation. fairly cheap innovation that drives much, much better technology that then everyone will want to buy. And actually, it turns out that I think most politicians would also like to do that, but it's just not, this is not the conversation that we have. On the sidelines of the Paris Agreement, we actually had most of the leaders that you normally hear about with climate, together with Bill Gates and a lot of the other rich billionaires, coming together and saying we should spend a lot more on innovation in this world. Because innovation is what makes us rich and is what solves most problems. And look, unlike the climate agreements that are literally going to cost trillions of dollars each year, this costs, in the tens of billions of dollars. So it's, like 100 times cheaper. Right. This is the kind of stuff we need to do. I'm afraid I can't really sort of point out. There's certainly no leaders. I'm not sure. We tried also to get to Trump to say innovation. Sure, he loves to say no to stuff. I'm not so sure that he was all that great at saying yes to something else. Well,
certainly as it relates to energy compared to Biden, right? Find me a single American Democrat who is going to say yes, we need to allow India to frack. I'll eat my hat, sir.
That's not going to happen.
No. I need to find a hat and I'll eat it. But yes.
But we need more politicians who are actually going to say, instead of just saying no to a lot of stuff, which will never work in the long run, we need to find politicians who will say innovation is the way forward.
Well, and I think this is the one area I agree with your direction. I don't have the trust in government. So, for example, this innovation often does come from the private sector. Rather than spending any money, not taking money from the people innovating. I mean, for example, horses aren't extinct. People moved on to the Model T because Henry Ford gave it to us, right? And people wanted to have a Ford. People can still use salt to preserve food if they want to smoke the meat and stuff, but they prefer refrigeration. They weren't outlawed. They weren't banned. You didn't need to subsidize it. What about an approach of, especially considering how charitable American people and businesses are, just not taking so much of their money? Otherwise, we're trusting these governments to spend these billions where we want it to go, even if the solution is a correct one.
I hear your point, and I think there's certainly some value to it. Let me just give you a sort of economist argument for why there might be an argument for governments to be spending this. Remember, again, fracking was made possible because government was willing to pony up a little bit of money to try this out in 20 years to get it right. And then fracking just ran on its own. The iPhone, and there's been many of these other examples, a lot of the things that went into it, the World Wide Web, were first done by government. So there is an argument to sort of spend a little bit of seed money. And if you look at, for instance, a lot of other research into diseases, we have government spend a lot of money on, if you will, blue sky research, the kind of stuff that delivers Nobels. But then eventually we hope that goes into stuff that'll become a medication that you can get a private company to make and sell and get everyone to buy. So the point is, there's a good argument to make the research that is long-term and that's hard for individuals to recoup their investments from. The main problem is if you spend money, you come up with a great idea, but the idea will only break through in 20 or 30 years. Your patent has run out. And that's why we need to make sure that we have these universities and researchers and eggheads delivering all those things that will eventually make us rich in 20, 30, 40 years.
I would, and not to be adversarial, but I would disagree with the premise just using those examples, okay? And this is something I've, worked studied this for a while. And I don't know, I'm a comedian, but, I was there at the Cancun Climate Summit, and I've been covering this for a long time. It's how John Stossel and I met. You talk about fracking. Now, fracking wasn't made possible because government funded it. Fracking was made possible, sure, it coincided with the government not being punitively prohibitive. The internet is another example. You mentioned the internet. It was basically used as glorified intercom, right, to sort of militarily. Only once it was opened up to private innovators did it become the internet that we knew today. Drug research, we talk about, well, there's no country in the history of the world that's provided new medical innovation outside of the United States. And the vast majority of that has come from the private sector. That's why when Canada went public, their medical research actually just plummeted to an unparalleled degree. So I think sometimes there's the chicken or the egg, and people think it's because of government. No, hold on a second. There were points in time where the government reins and the shackles were removed and the private sector was able to innovate. I think it needs a little of both. but I don't want to give too much credit to government.
I just want to mention one thing. Mitchell, who was probably the single biggest guy in sort of getting the fracking through, he's on record for saying very much it would never have had without the support of the DOE for a decade or more.
Well, he's not going to not take the money.
No. But it sort of suggests that it's hard to actually. He had a hard time, for instance, convincing his investors to keep doing this, and that was why DOE was necessary. My point here is simply to say that we should spend much less money, but more smartly in innovation. And there's a lot of good examples on how innovation has been helped along with good investment from governments, just simply because the time frame is too long for private interest to be able to recoup the full benefit.
And I agree with that. And I think if we're going to be making investments at all, that it should be made in areas that have a proven track record, as opposed to every green investment, quote unquote green, has been a disaster, right? Things like Solyndra, if you look at the subsidizing of solar and wind, which you've discussed quite a bit.
Watch Louder with Crowder live, Monday through Thursday, 10 a.m. Eastern.